All right. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us today on Analytics Everywhere, Presets podcast, where we talk about, everything analytics. Today, we're joined by Avi Press from Scarf, and we've got a lot to get into. We'd like to hear how your project works, what you've learned, and all sorts of things. So I guess we can go around and do little quick intros if we want. Maybe I'll hand it over to you, Avi.
Sure. Name's Avi Press again. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. I'm the founder and CEO of Scarf, and we are a company that provides usage analytics and sales marketing intelligence for open source software. So my background is as a software engineer. Worked on big data kind of projects back at Pandora, doing a lot of like concert recommendation systems and these types of things. But as I got really into the side of being an open source maintainer, ran into this problem of, I don't know how my software is actually being used. And that's kind of taken me on this journey of analytics in a space that has not traditionally had much of it at all.
I'll follow with a quick intro. So I'm Max. I'm a user of Scarf. That's part of the reason why I'm here today. I'm also founder at Preset, and then I've been really involved in open source, very much like Apache Superset's been the main project I'm involved into over the past few years, or even like 5 years plus. And before that, I was working on Airflow. I've worked in big data too, and all sorts of analytics solution. And I'm very constantly wondering how well are the open source projects we're maintaining and using and putting love and work into, like, how are they doing? Are they doing better than last week and last month? Are they growing? All this stuff. So we're really interested in everything analytics, but everything analytics in relation to the open source project too.
Yep. And I'm Evan Rusakis. I'm a committer and a PMC member on the Apache Superset project and a developer advocate with Preset. And for those who don't know Preset, it's a managed hosted version of Superset as a service in a nutshell. So if you want to try out Superset, really easy peasy, just sign up for a free account and you hit the ground running. But I also helped implement Scarf on Superset, which was something we can get into. There's a little bit of process into implementing something like this in an open source project, which is kind of an interesting story, perhaps. But maybe, Avi, we should have you kind of explain a little bit about what Scarf is and how open source projects can take advantage of this.
Yeah. Like we said, this is generally a tool to help you understand how the software is actually getting used. And so in practice, we can help you collect data in a variety of ways, whether that's download metrics, whether that's tracking how your documentation and content that you might be putting out there is being read, or as deep as full-blown telemetry. If you want to send events when when various things in your code happen, those can be sent to us as well. And the idea is that we can take all these different signals, stitch them together, and give you a pretty holistic picture of what's going on with your project, from how many users do we have, to what versions are in use, to which companies are using this, and everything in between. Which I think historically, we've gone from a total download count on a registry to we know quite a bit about how this stuff gets used, and so it's like a pretty big jump from where things.
Yeah, I'll jump in with that. Like the basic stuff. There's like the stars, right? Like everyone knows that stars, GitHub stars, are just a vanity metric. They don't mean very much. I mean, they correlate with like hype, maybe, or people who visit your GitHub, or people want to bookmark your GitHub kind of, or do an act of like, I'll give you a star, but that's not a super strong signal. Download we should get into too. Like historically, we've had downloads from in the Python world, PyPI or npm in the more JavaScript front end world. But these downloads in the era of CI and Docker are kind of subjective. They're interesting. Like you can kind of measure against themselves, but they're very like tip of the iceberg and kind of hard to make sense of. Telemetry, putting pixels in open source is a little bit sensitive, and I think you need some guarantees there around tracking, and there's some legal aspects of that. And with the Apache Software Foundation, like as much as we want to know as much as possible about the users and who's using the product and how much so, we got to do that in a very good and sensible way, right? And then like Scarf kind of does that, which is nice, right? Because if we were to do the tracking, we would have to be extremely cautious around and anything that has to do with identity. But having a third party that knows how to do that and navigates that for us, you know, you can kind of get rid of the right level of information while keeping the right level of information too. So I think that's super key, and so much more than like looking for downloads and stars. Like then you can actually have a framework to get a sense of like what's happening. And everyone, I think, who spends a lot of cycles on open source like should know, right? Should want to know, and then should know how they're doing, because that informs what you should do, you know, and how much effort you should spend, and where you should, which versions are people using still, right? Like how do you get people to upgrade, or do you need LTS, like long-term support for older releases? And is the new feature, are people turning on this feature flag, you know, that that you just release or not, you know? So I think that's all of that is extremely important.
Yeah, totally. And I think like, I mean, as a maintainer, it's just so much more, you know, we talk about maintainer burnout all the time and these kinds of things. And it's just, I think from a very like open source sustainability perspective, very important that we can direct maintainer efforts at the right stuff, because it's a brutal thing being an open source maintainer sometimes. Like it's a lot of work. It's sometimes very thankless. And if you can prioritize your time better, I think that's a win for everybody.
Yes, the burnout coming from the fact that you don't know enough about, you know, how people are using the product, or maybe because no one's using the product, you know, that would be, or you don't know, you know, maybe you don't know.
Yeah. And it was definitely the case for me. You know, I was at one point in a position of trying to assess, like, do I quit my job to work on open source stuff full time? I have a lot of people asking me for stuff. And just I think like just this like kind of feeling around in the dark, basically wondering what I should be doing, if it's the right stuff, these kinds of things. And it just got to the point where like every time a GitHub notification goes off, I'm like, oh, anxiety twinge, like what happened now?
Yeah, that jump, like making that jump, like for people to say like, I want to work full time on open source. So there's probably as many people, or you know, people that could make the jumps that are not making the jump because they don't know how popular their stuff is. There's probably the other way too, where people have made the jump, and if they would have known more, maybe they shouldn't have made the jump, or not just yet, right? They can time the jump.
Yeah, I think, you know, we've you know, sometimes we get to give people really great news that like, oh, you have tons of companies using your software, you have a lot of commercial opportunities. And other times we have the tough job of saying like, you know, that those huge spikes of downloads, it's coming from 2 IP addresses. I hate to break this news to you, but like it's the reality. And you know, tens of millions of dollars of VC capital deployed for download spikes that are totally just noise and it's nothing. And these kinds of things are really it's just wild. It's crazy.
Do we want to get into downloads as a metric? Like, what does it mean, or how to make sense of it? Maybe I can start by just saying like what's the part of the problem is. Like one thing is, well, so first there's different ways to download the software or to get it running. One is like git clone, and then there's, you know, the package manager, pip install, npm install. Then there's like a bunch of Docker in the middle and Docker cache. So it won't ever, you know, touch these points. And then we don't necessarily manage these endpoints. So like, how do you guys do it? And then like, how do we make more sense out of downloads in general?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so I think as you said, like this is a very noisy signal. And anytime you're looking at a channel, it's kind of an incomplete picture of what's going on. And so I think there's kind of a couple concepts here that I think are really important. So one is pairing a download count with some notion of uniqueness is very important, because package managers are supposed to cache stuff, but sometimes they don't, right? And like, just because you have a registry that expects some, you know, a client to behave a certain way doesn't mean that they will. And so it's always important to say, I think, you know, we have this many downloads from this many unique sources, and that kind of contextualizes those things. And our
data unique sources, like, would that be an IP for you? And I know you kind of, redact the IP from your database.
Yeah.
Maybe like you call it like the hash of an IP
Right.
or something like that. But just wondering if, say, GHA, like all the traffic coming from like hosted GitHub, does it look the same, or do you know which repo is coming, or which subset of GHA it might be coming from?
Yeah, it's a good question. So sometimes, so we have actually in Scarf, we actually have two notions of uniqueness. So we have what we call an endpoint ID, which is essentially a hashed IP address. We also have an origin ID, which is a hashed, so it's basically like all the identifiers that we have. So it'd be like an IP address, a user agent, and then any other kinds of identifiers which you might have access to in the headers. And so you have like one that's kind of overcounting in some cases, one that's undercounting in some cases. And if you're trying to like assess how many users, it's somewhere in the middle of those two things probably. Um, and it's really hard to do a whole lot better than that because ultimately you don't, this is all anonymous traffic. Things like the client has a lot of information there, and you can start to get it like, oh, this is, probably GitHub Actions, or this is probably CI, given it's like on an EC2 instance or on Azure, and what the user
Right, there's
agent
like
looks like.
the stuff like Amazon or GitHub, like think the big data centers of the world that host CI type workload on behalf of others.
Right.
Even I don't know if like Docker Hub does it, or yes, then it becomes just really hard. There's like when right? So if it comes from an IBM register, you're like, okay, there's someone at IBM.
Right.
Maybe. Yeah.
Right.
But for
And
others, it might just be harder to figure it out.
there's still things you can do there. Like sometimes you actually do see that it's this company renting an IP from Amazon. So that sometimes does show up in the metadata. In some cases, it's not super common, but there are, in billions of events, like that kind of thing comes up pretty regularly. Yeah. And then and that's why it's also important to pair this with other metrics, right? Like you have a lot of traffic that is coming from these ephemeral IPs, but by looking at the docs, you can see what people are actually reading on their laptop, and you can kind of get a better sense of the organizations behind the traffic. So yeah, I think like that's one of the things with like contextualizing these downloads is knowing kind of the where they originate from. But then the other one is looking at the behavior of the downloads over time in aggregate. So like, do we see people come back? What versions are they downloading? Like someone pulling the latest version of your Docker container is not really the same as them pulling a stable release every month. And so the usage patterns matter. And the usage patterns are kind of unique to open source in a lot of ways. And so that's like part of the work that we do is figuring out what those behaviors actually mean in an open source context and what we can learn about them from the statistics.
Yeah, it's like navigating between on one side, the writing the line of like maintaining privacy, and there's a hard step there, and preserving lack of identity and things like that, and everything you do, plus like getting a maximum of insight. So you're kind of riding in between those two zones. Yeah,
which has been, I think, one of the trickiest parts about building Scarf is figuring out where that line is. And to be clear, like we've had our share of trying things that I think were less popular for those reasons, and that's why we've actually found that when we try a modality of analytics that's unpopular, like I get on a call with those people who are getting really upset about it and really understanding with them about like what aspect of this was tricky. Like, do you understand that the package registry already had this data? So like, what, or, just really figuring out where those lines are for people. And I think that's one of the things that has made us get this far, is that we're kind of willing to do that.
Yeah, and I know that issue obviously came up when we implemented Scarf in Superset, and we had to kind of tell the community this is what we're tracking, this is what we're not tracking, and kind of addressed everybody's concerns. And I think where you sit in terms of privacy is a pretty acceptable spot. But how did that work with the software foundations like the ASF? How much work did it take to get that data processing agreement with them? And
the ASF one was really interesting. So what actually happened there is we just a few projects just adopted it kind of before we'd ever talked to anybody at the foundation. And they were using it really happily for a while, and we didn't really know that there were any like foundation level requirements for us. And then like one day, one of the maintainers reaches out, like seemingly a bit panicked, saying like the ASF is making us remove Scarf. Like, please talk to this person and get some kind of agreement in place.
That was before our time too. And by the way, like I just want to specify the ASF is the Apache Software Foundation for people not familiar with it.
Sorry,
I don't know if you mentioned it, but then just like explain it a little bit further too. So if you've used, Apache, Apache Kafka, Apache Hadoop originally, and now like Apache Airflow, Apache Superset that I contributed to in the past, or that Evan and I worked on for Superset. So they're a software foundation that essentially they own the IP and the trademark, and instead of like governance rules and models for the software that they host at the Apache Software Foundation, they provide some tooling for us. They pick up the bill for GitHub, but they get a deal with some of the service providers to get things for free and pass that over to us. They provide some legal guidance for us to protect people working on open source, but also people using open source in all sorts of ways. So, they're kind of they're navigating that line too, and they define some of the rules. And being one of the leading software foundations, I think, and they're pretty conservative. I don't know if conservative is so loaded nowadays. I can't use that term, but they don't like change very much, and they're very
cautious.
They're very cautious. And I think like what they do influences what other software foundations do, or defines like best practices in open source, because they're one of the maybe the more senior software foundation, put it nicely, and influential too.
Yeah, totally. And like, it's a huge responsibility that the foundation takes on to do all these things and to find the right sets of policies and governance and all these things where like completely competing companies can be collaborating on one project, which is like really incredible when you think about like what those systems have achieved. And so what that means is to work with the ASF, there was a lot of, it's got to fit into the model really cleanly. Yeah, exactly. It's got to fit in. And so
not only navigating the red tape, but you're getting in a new area. Sometimes like there's no red tape here yet, but we need to lay it down and define exactly where it's going to go and not going to go. And often it's by trial error. People are like, wait, what is this person doing in this zone? They're not supposed to be there, or we went too far. Okay, let's adjust, like put some tape in the right places so that everyone can be happy. For instance, like one very clear area is, do you make some of that telemetry opt-in or opt-out, right? Like, should it be by default on? I think that's not a decision for Scarf. I think for Scarf, you need to allow us as a community to decide what defaults we're going to use. But we definitely need to allow for people to opt out. And then there's a question, is it opt-in or opt-out by default, right?
Right. And I think, and this is something that we had a trajectory on too, as we were kind of learning what was going to be best. And what we've landed on now, yeah, like you said, is you provide the tools to do whatever projects want to do. Ultimately, they decide what's right for their project, and open source covers so much ground that there are just there's every kind of situation. What we land on by default is that most of the analytics is opt-in by default, where you have to explicitly say, I want to opt out of analytics. I always mix up the terminology.
Opt-in by default.
So you're opted in by default. You can explicitly opt out if you want to. Not only that, but there also should be multiple ways to opt out, because in certain cases, the opt-out mechanism might not be doable, right? Like if you have to put in an environment variable to opt out, well, now your CI pipeline is probably not going to have that variable, and what do you do? Or, these kinds of things where sometimes it's more or less difficult to set that flag.
Yeah, one method might be more convenient for a certain person, an environment.
Exactly.
And another, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and so most of the mechanisms that we provide, there's kind of multiple ways to turn it off, and so that might be environment variables. It might be like you can opt out of like our JavaScript telemetry in a package JSON config. You can just set it in the package JSON of your project, and it won't send analytics. And then we also will respect do not track headers, global privacy control headers, all these kinds of things to kind of respect other standards that have been built on the web for how to opt out of these things.
Are there modes? I know for us, like we're very conservative and following the ESF and all this stuff. Are there modes that are more like aggressive? So if a different project wanted to track much more, potentially could they? Or is there a different level of privacy that are fitted for different projects that might be more or less concerned with?
Yeah, this actually gets really interesting and tricky when you think about like any kind of analytics in like a library that gets embedded in another stack, and you might have a tree or like some random set of those packages have different privacy settings. And basically how we chose to handle that is that the user invoking the code has full control over the whole tree. But by and basically the further up, basically the top of the tree can control what its dependencies are doing. But if they don't set something, the thing below that will set the policy. So you kind of cascade down, and then you send analytics kind of based on what this tree thing. It gets really complicated.
Right.
And then,
I think it is fundamentally like a decision for the community to make, or for the software foundation that, for us, we enter it from the Apache Software Foundation.
Yeah.
And as long as it's clear too what you're doing, right? Of like by default, it's this is how you opt out. One thing I've been saying in the past is like, okay, not everyone's going to contribute to open source, right? That's totally fair. But if you don't contribute to the code or to the community, or give a talk, write a blog post, or contribute a PR, file an issue, the least you can do, maybe, and you don't have to do that, but like a really easy thing you can do is just to let the world know that you use this piece of software and be public about it. And one way to do it is just by not opting out, or by opting in if that's a piece of software that's opt out by default, or even to go and just some projects have like in the wild type of file, or like who uses this project in the README. So go add your name, to the project. That's a really easy way to build kind of social capital for the project.
I think it helps a lot more than people realize. It really does help quite a bit. Yeah,
absolutely. And for those that happen to be listening to this from the Superset crowd, it's worth maybe saying that we use most of your features. I think we use the Scarf gateway to track the downloads. We've got the telemetry pixel built into Superset. We've got the npm Scarf.js package. And for those who are wondering, is this on for me? The docs are full of ways to turn it off, and we've made it very easy. So if you want to opt out, please just look at the Superset docs.
And we don't have the information we have is like there is someone downloading the software somewhere, or using the software. We don't know you are. We don't know your IP. Like at that level, Scarf that removes all of that.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have your IP. That all gets scrapped. So all we have is kind of aggregated information, and it's been really helpful to know. Like when we release a new version, has that new version been adopted, or do we have to support the old version? It's been really helpful. Like on the documentation, we can see which pages of the docs are being used the most, which tells us where we should put our maintenance effort. All that stuff's been great for us as a project. But I guess the question I'm building up to really is, since you do this work for so many projects, are you seeing what kind of insights do you get at sort of the macro level? And or what sort of lessons have you learned in building this project and scaling it in terms of data?
Ooh, okay. Two very big questions. So maybe I'll take.
Sorry to
no, it's fine. Let's see. So insights from kind of all the data across have been interesting. So I think let's see. So one is just that open source is used everywhere. It's just like, it's really, most countries, governments, we are seeing download open source. We see, I think we're at 95% of the Fortune 500 actively downloads open source through us. So we have a lot of surveys that say these things in the open source world. We have more hard data that shows this kind of thing in real time. And then there's things interesting version adoption patterns. Most of your users are not going to upgrade as much as you would like to. There's a security patch, most of your users probably don't have it. And these kinds of things that people wish were not the case. Yeah, and I think, like how folks kind of navigate from, readmes to downloading, or there's kind of a lot of insights about how, what kinds of things actually get people to take that user journey, take that next step, these kinds of things. And that's what we help a lot of our customers with. So yeah, I think it's just a lot about how people use open source and how prevalent it is, I think, are some of the main things. And then maybe the last one that I'll say is that, and we've kind of touched on this already, but the download metrics are really misleading. If you just look at those download counts, they're incredibly misleading.
Yeah, even I think in general, just like when you're trying to, we have two columns, one IP address, before you kind of get rid of it or hash it, and then you have on the other side a web page, a kind of URL. Like there's a lot of information encoded in these two things, but it's kind of really hard to make sense of it, right? So processing a URL to figure out like what action is this URL and this whatever is after the question mark, or the three level of folders, or the domain information is similar with the IP too. Is this list of IP rented to some company or some other sub company re-renting from this cloud vendor? So that gets really, really complicated there.
Yeah. I think it's really messy, really fast.
I had a question or two. So one, I think that would be interesting. Maybe I can talk about like what it takes to implement the different pieces of Scarf. So I know one is if you have a Docker Hub or PyPI npm, like package manager, I think it's a prefix or some sort of redirect. So you kind of change the prefix to point the Scarf hosted URL, and you guys do I assume, a redirect behind the scenes, just a server-side redirect.
Generally, we redirect. Sometimes we have to proxy, and these are some of the really like hairy pieces of complexity of this, where like some clients don't handle a redirect properly in an auth handshake, and you have to proxy that. In general, we want to redirect because we don't want to add overhead to a download.
Yeah, it's just for download to get all those bits, those bytes kind of flowing through you.
And then we're paying egress on that, which is no good. But sometimes we don't really have a choice, because we never could have really gotten adoption as broad as we have if like old clients wouldn't pull correctly through.
And you can go and fix the open source code of that client to support.
We are doing that slowly, yeah, but it's it's whack-a-mole basically. Like these clients all behave kind of different, and so we've done the work of figuring all that out. But yeah, the gateway is like a very it's really globally distributed, extremely fast, very, very redundant, these kinds of things, to make sure that all the downloads are quick around the world. And we will occasionally get like a customer report like, oh, we're getting reports of slow downloads in central China, please fix. And these are the problems that come with like essentially being a registry in some way, or being in front of a registry. So that's been a really critical part of our system that a lot of work goes into.
So there's the download. You just kind of prefix your download is one way to implement. The other one is like putting a pixel in some sort of header somewhere on your website. I think people are very familiar with this approach. Is there any other instrumentation?
There's also like SDKs that can send it, so like the Scarf.js that you guys use in Superset, and that's just like a post install hook kind of thing.
Or if you say like npm run a certain thing, or like you have a CLI, it could log some things there too.
Right, and then you have a lot of the complexity of like giving lots of ways to opt out, and never slowing down a build, and interacting with the dependency tree, and all these kinds of things. And all these mechanisms are just ways to send data to Scarf, and then we have the fun job of processing all of that data.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So in terms of like the stack, I'm really curious. So we have a lot of people probably who listen this particular podcast, and Alex everywhere. We have all sorts of like data professionals, and we're always all interested in data stack, right? So curious, like how much you can share about the stack behind the scene. Do you have any of that as open source too, or I mean, it's probably made out of open source bits and pieces?
Definitely made out of open source. So a lot of a lot of the front end aspects of this, like our gateway, is open source. These SDKs are all open source, and we open source lots of tools. The data pipeline is the proprietary part of our system, since it's pretty purpose built for like the business that we have, and that made less sense to be fully open source, although pieces by piece we are.
Try to be like close to real time. I imagine. I always
It's
assume when
quite
I
real
go there.
time.
Yeah, so it's very
Yeah.
real time. So there's probably some Kafka and some like stream computation
Yes.
maybe, and then do you
Yeah.
have an in-memory streaming database like Druid or something like that? Or I don't know. I don't know how much you can share.
No, I can share all of it totally. And I think, I guess as a real quick sidebar, when does this go out? Because there's actually a change coming to this, so I don't know like when this will
Oh,
go live.
within a week.
Okay.
A few days probably.
So I guess,
I think
depending
it might be
on,
interesting to talk about the before and after and why
Yeah.
too. It's like what?
yeah. Okay. So what we started with, well, originally when we were really small, it was all just going to Postgres, right? And that was enough for a while. As we grew, we then needed to basically all the different like gateway instances would be sending their all the events to Kafka queues, and then we would have Kafka consumers that were pulling the events down, processing them, and then writing them to S3 storage and to Postgres. The S3 stuff was for like long-term storage, for exports, these kinds of things. And we were kind of dual writing parsed events to Postgres. And
Any
S3.
replica on Postgres? So did you do like the transaction log where you have kind of a main instance and then other instances that can take the load, or just one? I mean, you can push one fat Postgres pretty far.
It was like we were using RDS, or we are using RDS, so it's kind of your normal like main and just a lot of replicas basically for redundancy. Yeah.
The replica I know is a very common use case with MySQL, where you have kind of your main like write, and then the transaction log is sent to other replicas that are read only, and you can
right. Yeah, and I guess like RDS kind of hides a lot of that from you. It just kind of takes care of it.
Yeah, you can kind of set that with a button, like I want 6 replicas, and that's it.
Yeah, exactly. And so we were at like 2 for a long time, and that was cool. Kept our service up, and everything was great. Then that this big table of all the download events got really big, and it stopped scaling, and we had to start aggregating them ahead of time. And so then we were basically same kind of thing, off of Kafka, parsed events into S3, but we were kind of in real time doing these aggregations. And it'd say like, on this day, this package had 10 downloads, and you were just updating that every day, and then doing that for the week and for the
stream
month.
computation, is that like one of the stream compute? What is popular these days, like Spark streaming, or like I know Samza was an early one. Now the Kafka, what is the main one? Stream
computation? There's oh god, I'm blanking on the name. There is Flink, I think, does a lot of this kind of thing.
Flink is probably the most popular.
And
that's another
we weren't using
Foundation hosted project, Apache.
Yeah, and we were doing this all kind of a home rolled version of it, and that was really great in some ways, in that it scaled really well. Because you're kind of pre-computing stuff, so dashboards would load like immediately most of the time, because everything's kind of pre-rolled up. The problem with that is that the roll-ups are lossy, right? So if I have like my roll-ups of like downloads per day, downloads per geography, downloads per client, you've rolled away that information. So if you want to like I want the Linux downloads on this version in Canada, you kind of rolled that away, and you don't actually have access to it. If there's a bug, you have to go back and reprocess the data. And so it got brittle as we grew. And now what we are rolling out right now, and I think by the time listeners are listening to this, it will be live to most of our users, it's all going straight to ClickHouse. And so the dashboards basically just do live ClickHouse queries, and
no summarization on the fly. So then you still have a message queue like Kafka, though, too.
Kafka is still the durable queue, and all of the processing is still asynchronous, but at query time, it's all real time. And we'll probably need to have caching on this on top of it as well. But for right now, ClickHouse is performing pretty well for us. And well, we're just rolling this out, so we're about to hit all the problems that we're going to run into.
I mean, that's exactly kind of the use case, for it. It's like append only, log in memory, real-time database. I'm sure like Druid and Pinot would probably do fairly well. I hear ClickHouse doesn't require as much kind of modeling. Maybe it doesn't have as many like knobs and switches and button. It just kind of works well out of the box, but might not allow you to fine tune it for a specific workload as much. So I don't know. I'm not up to date on all the. I don't want to say anything wrong about, like, I've got friends at all three companies.
Yeah, I mean, we really
they're all
like.
great. They're all very competitive.
There are a lot of great analytics databases, and we looked at a bunch of them, and it was actually quite a close call because like some of them have very similar strengths and weaknesses, but I think like ultimately there were a lot of good options for like managed ClickHouse services, and so we don't even really manage it ourselves so far. And
Is there any way we could get? And then that's an interesting question. That's more like self-centric. Like, could we ever have access to that database for us to run whatever query? Well, it becomes difficult because it's a multi-tenant database, right? So you have multiple hosted project. I should never see what's happening in other projects than Superset, as a maintainer of Superset, to have access to it. But is it partitioned in a way, or would there be a way to expose access to that database for us to build pretty dashboards? Because that's what we do at Superset.
Yeah,
We build like pretty dashboards and things. Wondering if there's any way we could do that.
So it is possible. And on July 16th, we're having an event where we're kind of announcing some features that are in this direction. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of where everything was going with Scarf, was that we had these like very standard data visualizations that we were doing, and we didn't really have a lot of flexibility with it because of these aggregations. And that's what we were pre-computing. That's what we could make load quick. And now that we have this flexibility with an analytics database, it's much easier to slice and dice it arbitrarily. And so we're not quite at a point where you have like your own complete database that you can just full-blown write SQL against, but we're getting towards it.
The thing is, the data set is fairly simple, right? It's static. It doesn't really change over time, right? You have like the time of the event, what you can infer from the IP address. There's the URL, the region, like what you can infer. I guess that's part of what you can infer from the IP is the region or something like that, some sort of geo. Though I think the intricacies that you cannot know about is like the regex parsing of the URL. Like, some URLs might mean a lot to us, but you can't know what those regular expression like rules on the URL could be. So some flexibility around that offered to us would be really powerful, as long as it remains, kind of private and everything. So you have to remove everything from the URL that would indicate some sort of like, user ID, and make sure there's nothing.
Right. Yeah. Headers get really dicey, right? Like there's some things that can be in there that are like auth tokens and stuff. And so it's definitely not trivial to do, but that has been one of the really nice things with the flexibility of these kinds of databases, is that like you're not really constrained anymore, which is really cool. But there is like a whole can of worms when it comes to like, the multi-tenants of this, or like, making sure that you're not letting people query data that's not theirs, and and also not getting like regex DOSed and these kinds of things too. There's a lot of
noisy neighbors too, like big projects like us that take half the size of the table because we have so many downloads compared to everybody.
On the plus side, even today you can download the event history very granularly. You can actually just download that, and then you can analyze it however you want, really, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, so like even today folks will like export like a big CSV from Scarf. You like load it up in like DuckDB or something, and you just query it however you want, which is pretty nice. And that was basically a principle that we had really early on, which was give people access to the data to do whatever they want with it, but then build kind of the lowest common denominator dashboards as we get more and more complex over time. Because you can spend arbitrary amounts of time on data visualization and graphing and stuff. And as you guys know better than anybody, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing.
You can spend easily a decade of your life working on that.
So we didn't want to take that on. We leave that to the experts.
That's an interesting position to be in too, because like you are the host for data that is kind of your customers in some ways, right? So you're hosting data, and that's the case with CRM and there's a lot of tools, or it's a fairly common pattern to that, like, I guess that's the SaaS pattern ultimately, like but like people are like, wait, this is my data, I should be able to run arbitrary workload on it, or just bring it back to myself after you process it. So all of that makes sense, but it brings some challenges of like, okay, well, now you have the data, we want the data too. There's all sorts of data syncs and replication issues there, and then we sync it twice. Should we just query your ClickHouse, or do we really need to bring in our big query or in our ClickHouse when it's already there for the takings? Kind of interesting topic there, where I see eventually, like, if you were on Snowflake or BigQuery, you could just say, hey, we'll expose the raw data, and you can put your compute on top within that cloud database on top of or shared kind of data, right?
Yeah, that is very interesting. I've never thought about doing that actually. I mean, the approach that we are taking is just making it really easy to put the data wherever you want it to be. So like right now, you can turn on daily exports from Scarf into an S3 bucket, and then you can load it up into your Snowflake. And that's kind of what some of our customers will do. And now we're like, that's like, it's easy to get into like a common, blob storage situation. Which lets us connect to a lot of different platforms with one hop. And so now we're building the zero hop integrations, like put it right into Salesforce, put it right into, whatever.
And you're in Kafka, so in theory, you can just have some, you're in Kafka, maybe you have some Flink already. So in theory, there's all these different syncs you can point to, right? Like out of Kafka to be like, hey, you want this in a, in a BigQuery or in whatever it might be, we'll do it. Or another Kafka, like from your Kafka.
Yeah, very true. Actually, yeah, connecting to other people's Kafkas is an interesting idea. Like we just need to build all these connectors over time, essentially.
I'm not sure. Like if I could have anything, I'm not sure what would ask for as a community for super. Like selfishly, I think like we use a lot of BigQuery, so like to dump it in BigQuery would be useful. But as a community, it could be cool because, like, so for us, the way that we go about this is everyone, all the committers within the so people in the superset community that have right access to the repo, that have been vetted by the Apache Software Foundation and elected as a committer, they have access to Scarf currently, and we can just go in your UI and we can kind of browse around. But yeah, if we were to decide as a community, maybe we'd say like, I'll send that back to ASF hosted Postgres or
right. I think it's a really important piece of it. It's just like, whether it's, whether it's like legally with respect to GDPR or just like spiritually, this is your data and we process it for you and try to make useful stuff out of it for you. And that's what we exist to do. And so, in practice, that there's a lot of challenges that come with that, but it's the kind of model that works really well and why I think the foundations have been on board. Yeah.
Speaking of getting on board with things, you alluded to an event on the 16th. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. I believe we'll be talking again.
Yes, yeah. So we have our very first Scarf Summit on July 16th. Both Evan and Max will be there as well. So I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys there.
Likewise.
Yeah, we're going to be... we're going to be talking just about this topic of, open source analytics broadly, but then we just have a lot of product updates that we've been working on. This whole, we got into it here a little bit, but this migration to ClickHouse, which has been a huge undertaking, unlocks a lot of stuff for us. So it's both like, all the things that you can do with this flexibility, but then all the things that can be built on top of it. And so we have a lot of stuff to announce. So for anyone who, is using Scarf and wants to hear kind of the latest of what we're up to, or if this is a topic that you are, is piquing your interest now and you want to get into it, it'll be a great event.
Scarf curious, it's, like, I think every open source contributor, people that have, interest, non-commercial, not necessarily commercial, around open source too. Like, you want to know what's happening with your projects. I think it's good to know what is something I can just kind of tap into to get a bunch of analytics I don't have today. It's just a matter of changing your links, here and there, and then you start getting good intel. Because, like, quite frankly, once you've tasted the Scarf, it's hard to go back to just stars and download, which you can't really get the download stuff. Like, if you go on PyPI for say for Superset, you'll just see a number for the month, I think, or all time. Like, there's no way to get like charts. There's a BigQuery thing they expose.
The BigQuery thing is still
not bad.
way better than other languages, I will say. Like, props
Yeah.
to the Python folks that did that. But it's
And
still limited.
Like, there are
It's still
specialized
limited.
services that keep track of things and maybe that can materialize stuff that are very limited too, right? Like, I think there are services that keep track of the PyPI counts or the NPM counts and
Yeah.
build some charts, you know, and put together a nice little website, but there's no look at it per region and look at downloads and per version. So all these you need a Scarf like solution to do that.
Yeah, I think you know, open source is getting a lot more sophisticated in general. A lot more things rely on it, and we can do a whole lot better than just download counts.
It's open source all the way down. You talked about it earlier. I didn't take the tangent. I'm going to take it now. But like, like if you look, I'm certain that every single piece of software out there in the world that's been written in the past year, it's just like a little layer on top of a huge tree of dependencies that are all open source. That's just insane to think about it. The world, and if you think of like the lines of code that run in the software packages everywhere, it's gotta be like more than 90% of the lines of code are open source. I don't know that for a fact. I'm just like, that's more of a question than something.
It's gotta be a pretty significant amount, right? Like it's getting larger, like exponentially faster over time. And if you think about like the complexity of everything that we're doing, it's like just like sending a TCP request on the internet is there's a lot there.
Yeah, just to happen. Like for us to all be on a computer that, and be on the live session, we're quite beyond the analog telephone that, it's just insane. Everything that's happening just inside your house, inside your computer, or everything. It's just crazy.
Yeah.
There's no other way that open source to, like if you were to try to rebuild any of that, build a Zoom competitor in a fully proprietary kind of way.
Good
luck. It's not even possible, right now.
Oof, yeah. But I'd be keen to hear if you're trying to do this. Get in touch with me. I would like to hear about it.
Cool. Well, any parting words? Any other shout outs or ways for people to get in touch or connect with you that they ought to be aware of before we call it an episode?
Yeah, let's see. Our website is scarf.sh. Please check us out. Give Scarf a try. If you're wanting to, say hi, ask questions, or get involved, we have a Slack community that's kind of linked all over our website and docs. So don't hesitate to drop in and say hello. And join us on July 16th. There's a link to it on our website as well to join Scarf Summit. It is online, so it's open to anyone wherever in the world you are. I think that's about all I got. Yeah, thanks again for having me. It was really great. It was a really good conversation.
Yeah, we look forward to seeing you at the summit. Thanks for joining us today, and see you all next time.
Thank you all.
Take care.